Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is September 17th, 2022, and this is your daily Ukraine update, and we're going to be asking ourselves, is the Ukrainian offensive really over? Let's get into it. Okay, so when we look at the map, we can see, of course, the huge chunk of territory, basically everything to the east of Kharkiv and to the west of the river and reservoir here has basically been liberated by Ukraine, right up to the Russian border, and all the way down this river is where Russia has withdrawn its forces, and Ukraine has seized territory, as well as a considerable amount of gear, equipment, and munitions. Now, what's interesting is, of course, Russia has correctly realized that there's a natural barrier here that's going to blunt Ukrainian offensive operations, and that is this river, right? Even small river crossings are extremely difficult when you're talking about moving thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, vehicles, and material. It's a very dangerous operation because obviously, instead of being able to cross an entire front, you have to cross along the tiny number of the handful of bridges still available. That's why Russia has naturally, logically use this as a major defensive line. Right? You can see here they've lost Kupiansk, and Russia has had to establish a defensive perimeter outside the city, but they try their best to keep the Ukrainians on the western side of this river all the way down the line of contact until, and this is where things get interesting, you get down here into this region here near Eurova. Now, when we pull it back, we can see what's new today. We could see that, of course, Russia in Ukraine has continued to make some interesting advances. Now, we've discussed that Russia's ability to hold this line here is essential to stopping the Ukrainian counteroffensive, right? If the Ukrainians are able to loop around, they can continue their offensive into Russian territory. Right? Russia, remember, this river formation is a great defensive asset, but it's also a problem in its own right because Russian forces cannot counterattack across this effectively. They will have the same problems that Ukrainian forces would have, namely, again, crossing a lot of forces across a very narrow set of bridges. So this is a crucial area of fighting. But if we see, the Russians have been able to establish a defensive line here, but here's where things are really, I think, fascinating. If you remember, before the counteroffensive even started, right, when Russia still controlled all this territory, almost a month ago, Ukrainian forces, prior to even the official Kherson offensive, managed to cross this bridge here and seize a beachhead in the town of Ozerne. And initially, I think I was correct in this assessment, I had said that this was a sort of feint attack, a way of keeping Russia honest and making sure it hadn't withdrawn too many forces from this area, which you might recall, you can see here, Bohododichne, this was a really contested area 2 or 3 months ago. So just being able to get across the Dnipro River and take some small beachhead of territory. But as I said, beachheads don't last long. They either get pushed out of existence or expanded. And as we fast forward through the offensive, you can see that this beachhead was just sort of held in place, right? Obviously, the Russians were distracted by much bigger issues, namely Ukraine flipping 3,000 square kilometers of territory. But as we get closer to today, you can see that the Russian forces are actually, the beachhead in Ozerne begins to expand, right? Other Ukrainian forces cross the bridge here at Horodok, and then Russian forces are forced to withdraw as they're pinched between these two now contested territories. Now you can see that the Russians' classic tactic of encircling their opponents and forcing them to withdraw and yield territory, like what the Russians did to seize Lysychansk, is now being used against them. This here, you can see that the beachhead in Ozerne is expanding. This entire area is contested, and to the opposite side, to the northwest here, you could see Ukrainian forces are continuing to advance, and Russia is realizing that its forces are about to get cut off, pinned between the river and this swampland where they will have a hard time maneuvering. So they are forced to withdraw. Again, you're not seeing the giant flips of territory that you saw in Kharkiv, but this was not considered a majorly strategic region. Obviously, Kupiansk, an important rail hub and important for moving munitions and supplies around the country. But this is the scene of some of the most intense fighting of the war. And the Russians are having to make significant withdrawals, especially whenever they withdraw, again, from this Dnipro River, which is what they've been using as a defensive line for months. The fact that Ukrainians are making gains into territory where Russia really had reinforced its defensive lines is a sign that this counteroffensive may not be over just yet. So I will be fascinated to see if the Ukrainian forces simply link up their troops, right, seize this territory here in the coming days, and finally engage in consolidation and reorganization, right, an important phase of any offensive where you establish good defensive positions, you refit and resupply your troops. If you have to, you evacuate wounded, bring fresh troops up to the front lines, maintain your equipment, and prepare for the next round of offensives. Obviously, though, Russia's inability to establish any sort of substantial defensive perimeter is a huge liability for them. And every time they get pushed back, they have to reassess and reevaluate where they're going to establish defensive lines. All in all, this is probably not a great sign for Russia. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining me on this update. And as always, thanks to the patrons of Patreon. If you guys want to see the combat video breakdowns that YouTube won't let me show you, this is the most intense combat footage from the fighting in this war, and I do thorough breakdowns. You want to become a member of the Patreon. Thanks to all my patrons, but especially my Lieutenant tier patrons. I'm sorry, I'm on vacation, so I do not have the Lieutenant tier patrons ready available. Oh, here we go. Thank you, guys. Link is in the description. See you in the next one.